And Mark Urban is with us, as he is every Monday, to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Hello, Mark.
Morning.
Good morning. Welcome back. Good to have you with us. Let's talk, for a change, about Ukraine. Andy Burnham has arrived in Kyiv for his first foreign visit there since becoming Prime Minister. This comes as Britain agrees to share classified blueprints for long-range missiles to aid Ukraine's war effort. You can see that story on the front of the Times. Burnham is also going to be chairing his first Coalition of the Willing meeting, and he's expected to take part in the country's independence celebrations because it celebrates its 35th anniversary today. Mark, these missiles, these blueprints, first of all, they're long-range missiles. They're modelled on the French Scalp missile. They're apparently very important to the way Ukraine fights the war these days. Will giving them the blueprints allow them to do something that they cannot currently do?
They're limited in what they can do in that respect, that very specific type of strike weapon, because the stocks that the UK and France gave them of those missiles, Scalp, to the French Storm Shadow. You may remember all that discussion about those a couple of years back. Would they be allowed to use them? That's the British name. The stocks are pretty low now. And the Ukrainians would clearly like to make more. It's a pretty accurate missile. It maneuvers. It's harder to shoot down than some of the drones they've got. And it has a pretty high effect at the business end of it. So I don't think, though, that giving them the plans and saying it's okay to make them will have a very rapid effect, because obviously you've got to set up production, and that could take a while. So just like the key thing that they're really after this winter, which is more ballistic missile defense, those Patriot-type missiles, where for a moment Trump seemed to be saying they could make those too. It's a similar kind of answer that yes, it's useful, but it won't happen that quickly.
Britain seems to be cleaving closer to Ukraine, even as America sort of wavers more and more. And while this is in many respects precisely what the White House told us to do, how is this going to play in the White House? What will Donald Trump think about Burnham's sort of renewed support for Ukraine?
I don't think... there's definitely been in recent months a bit of a change in the American attitude. We know that the director of the CIA hit on this idea when briefing the president that he should paint Vladimir Zelensky as a winner, and that Trump would like that. And I think that there have been some signs of a more kind of permissive attitude on the part of the Americans to Ukrainian strikes in various places than there were, in the Biden years, for example. The difficult area, coming back to it again, is that defensive side, where the Americans have got themselves into a big mess, basically, by firing off an awful lot of what wasn't a very big stock of those Patriot missiles. Under Joe Biden, they gave 600 of those Patriots to the Ukrainians. Trump and the Pentagon are not inclined to give any more, and there is a European alternative, which President Macron has been sort of promising to step up deliveries of, but it can't compare numbers-wise with the sort of numbers that of interceptors that the Ukrainians have had in previous years. So we're really right down to the last 800 or 900 of those in the American stock. And to give you some sense, in previous winter, President Zelensky says he wants 300 for the defense of Ukraine this winter. So that's the really key thing that Trump could do for Ukraine. But, when the numbers are down that low in the American stocks, only at the expense of harming American readiness for any crisis in the Far East, or indeed a resumption of war with Iran. So that's really where the limits of policy bump up against the limits of what's actually possible as well. And makes for a very difficult winter, I think, for Zelensky in Ukraine.
We'll talk about what's coming up in the war itself in a moment. Before we do, look, as I said, Burnham, he's going to be chairing his first meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, which was set up under Keir Starmer. Explain to us what that is beyond a sort of rhetorical device, and whether it's going to be any different under Burnham.
Well, as the name implies, this is a term that's come into use over the years to basically take what people are willing to give. And, sometimes it can be a small member of NATO that says, oh, well, we've got some shells some of the East European ones, for example, in the early phase of the war. We've got some shells for these old Soviet-made artillery guns, and Ukraine could use them right now much more than we could, and so they sent them. And that's a way of basically garnering what all the different countries can do. But in this context, I think the really important ones are the European countries, because they're still committing significant amounts of money. And, Trump has again tried to turn things to his advantage there and saying, well, yes, we are still willing to send certain weapons to Ukraine, but Europe has to pay for them. So, in that sense, the coalition of the willing is important. All the way through this war, we've known that Ukraine needs three things to carry on fighting. That is people, money, and weapons. And on those last two, the money and the weapons, the European coalition of the willing is particularly important right now.
Sure. Look, Mark, moving on your Substack this week, you've written about the end of stalemates between Ukraine and Russia, arguing that both sides are now facing the pressure of an ongoing war. And we have seen, escalation. We've seen 2 people killed in Russia overnight. Can Vladimir Putin himself afford to continue the escalation of Russia's attacks, or are things likely to sort of draw back a bit?
Well, obviously, these are different sorts of societies. Russia, we're far less privy to the pressures that Putin may or may not be under, and the degree to which his advisors may be sugarcoating what are now some very poor economic and military indicators for Russia. The kind of financial tricks that they've used to avoid a crisis in the state budget, the kind of way they've kept increasing the sign-on bonuses for military volunteers to go there to Ukraine, all of those kind of things, the compensation they're paying to the hundreds of thousands who've lost family members there. All of these things are looking much harder for Putin. And if you went back a month or two, you'd say, well, now add to that the fact that Ukrainians are really able to sustain substantial bombardments deep inside Russia, whether that's the oil facilities or places where the Russians are making their drones and missiles, things like that. That's really gone up significantly this summer. So, of course, all of that we put in the bad for Putin column. But I think in the last few weeks, a few things have become apparent that aren't great for Zelensky either. And I think this means that both of these key protagonists in the war are coming to quite a difficult moment this autumn and winter about, will they carry on and by what means? So the first of those developments is we've seen that with Ukraine harming Russia more, Putin, I beg your pardon, has chosen to escalate with attacks, for example, on the airport at Leipzig, drones more and more often straying into NATO airspace or sea space, all of this kind of thing. So we can see him escalating, trying to draw in NATO more. We've now also seen in Kyiv a political challenge to Zelensky from Mikhailo Fedorov, the defense minister, who he sacked several weeks ago. And this isn't great. I mean, some polling suggests that actually it's kind of helped Zelensky because people are pulling together and they don't want political infighting at this time. And he could turn it to his advantage. But I think Fedorov does speak to a very significant number of Ukrainians who are looking at this fifth winter of the war with dread and are really not relishing the prospect of continuing the fight. So I think all of these things added together mean that both of these key protagonists and both sides in this are under pressure now in ways they haven't been before. And, of course, Ukraine can, and I expect will, keep up its deep strikes. And, that news we started with about Andy Burnham and the Storm Shadow missiles could, in the course of the coming months, help them to do so. There are so many other European countries and indeed the Americans providing deep strike weapons to Ukraine now that we can expect all that to go on. So what does Putin do next? I mean, we've seen saber rattling against Britain because Britain is also sending drones as part of this broad international effort to Ukraine and components for drones. And that, I think, is one of the big questions going forward. I mean, few people now just expect Putin to do what Zelensky said when launching this wave of deep strikes back in June, said he wanted, which is to come to the peace table. So, it could be a very difficult few weeks and months coming up.
Finally, Mark, the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has warned that an economic D-Day is coming for Iran as the US prepares to amp up its economic pressure on the country. He's going to be holding a press conference later today to discuss plans to bring in yet further sanctions. His comments are from his op-ed in the Financial Times where he announced these plans. How should we take this? Is this a sort of last-ditch effort to win, or is this some new effective strategy?
Yes, I mean, I think we've talked about this before. It took the Americans a long time, and when they started this war back in February, at the end of February, they didn't even have the naval forces in place to do a blockade, even if they wanted to, and even if they'd anticipated the Iranian closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which they clearly didn't do adequately. But once over a few months, they'd kind of got their act together, they'd got the requisite naval forces in place. I think it became clear that this pressure of the blockade on Iran is one of the only really effective tools that the Americans have left now. And, we've heard the head of the Iranian negotiating team just saying recently, talking about the pressure on the Iranian economy and saying they can't really allow that to continue indefinitely. Now, today, the Scott Bessent announcement is effectively trying to close off all the ways that Iran will try to use to get around that blockade of its ports. In other words, trading across land borders, other kinds of financial tactics it can use to try and bypass elements of that blockade of the seas. So that is quite an important inflection point. I think it is saying, yes, in the last week or two, the Americans have decided that economic pressure is the way. There shouldn't be further strikes unless they can be avoided. Now, of course, there are two sets of wills at play in this. And if the pips really are beginning to squeak for Iran, will they respond to these pressures with military strikes or military action, for example, to stop Saudi oil exports or to frustrate what's going on in terms of reconstruction of oil facilities in other Gulf states, things like that? So it remains unstable in that sense, but I think it's definitely the case that we see these measures being announced today as part of a program of economic pressure against Iran, which mark a turning point in the American strategy.
Mark Urban, thank you very much indeed.